And welcome once again for those live streaming to St. Peter the Apostle Anglican Church. We're continuing our series this morning on what is Anglicanism, Anglicanism 101. And today's going to be more of an intellectual history rather than a purely chronological history, because we're going to look at Henry II and Thomas Becket, Richard Lionheart and John, as their respective reigns and relationships and their effect or lack thereof on the church. And again, before we get into this, it's important to remember that what we are looking at is not a detailed historical analysis of every aspect of English history. We're looking at those elements of English history and those individuals that specifically bear on the relationship between the crown and the church and Rome. So when we start talking about all of these individuals, and we're actually going to start wrapping up the purely historical part very soon. Next week we're going to talk about the Fourth Lateran Council in the 13th century, 1215 and beyond, and how that set the tone theologically for the rest of the relationship between England and the papacy. Today we're going to see, probably, at least in my estimation, the watershed moment in the history of England itself that creates the impetus for the switch from a purely, let's say, collegial relationship, in quotes, collegial relationship, that the English church had with the Roman church to a subservient position. And these two iterations of relationships, Henry and Thomas and Richard and then his brother John, essentially create the foundation upon which the rest of, at least for the next 300 years, the rest of English relationships with Rome will be based. So Henry was, depending upon to whom you speak, he was a wise, strong ruler who was determined to restore law and order after the chaos of Stephen's reign. Some call him unscrupulous. I guess it's a matter of perspective. He set about to establish a strong government and a respect for authority. This was Henry's desire. And to some degree, he had been influenced by the revival of legal studies on the continent. And he saw the prime need for England to be a just legal system, justly administered. So the law for Henry was to be equal for all and universally applied. It may seem kind of trivial, but it immediately creates a problem, because his prime challenge to this effort was a practice known as the benefit of clergy. The benefit of clergy. This was introduced during William I's reign after the separation of the spiritual issues from civil courts. So William separated out those things that needed to be tried by the church versus those things needed to be tried by the civil courts. And it meant that any clerk could appeal to an ecclesiastical court for any misdemeanor with the exception of high treason. So, high crimes such as manslaughter, theft, rape, pillaging, assault, highway robbery, could be appealed to and then transferred to an ecclesiastical court so long as the clerk was tonsured. Anybody know what tonsured is? Haircut, yeah, that's one way of putting it, haircut. Tonsuring is usually done in a variety of ways, and it depends upon the particular order in which you are with which you're affiliated. It can be anything from merely clipping off the front part of your hair to putting a bald spot on the crown of your head, to cutting everything away and removing everything from the top, cutting everything from the side, and it just depends upon the particular order that one is affiliated with to determine what type of tonsure you get. So if you can prove that, then you immediately have the right to appeal to an ecclesiastical court. And the reason that became so critical, and which drove Henry crazy, was because most who had their crimes transferred to ecclesiastical courts from the civil court went unpunished. It was virtually a get-out-of-jail-free card. Ecclesiastical courts at this time, to be polite, were jokes. They were just ridiculous. There are even cases on record where, and if you can believe this, men were bribing their gaolers or jailers to simply give them a shave so that they could prove benefit and claim benefit of clergy. Henry found this, as you could imagine, highly objectionable, and the church, on the other hand, saw it quite differently. Once again, and here we bring it to a fine point, the question wasn't of justice. The question wasn't about what is correct. It's not even about what's true. The issue is one of authority. Who has the authority to determine what? If the church were merely an arm of the state, then everybody would be obligated to submit to the authority of secular jurisdiction, hence a type of Erastianism. However, if the church was an actual independent authority, separate from and superior to the state, then it could enforce its own laws and try men accordingly. This battle between church and state being fought by Henry was an extension of the long and universal tug of war being fought all over Christendom. It wasn't only England that was dealing with this battle of the relationship between church and state. So with the death of Archbishop Theobald in 1161, a successor was needed. The vacancy lasted a year, and you will see that a lot in the early portion of the Church of England. Now, we can be gracious or we can be realistic, and a more realistic approach as to why these vacancies occurred is because it was an opportunity for whoever was reigning to dip into the church coffers. Not every single one, but in the vast majority of cases, that's what occurred. So, after a year of being vacant, along comes Thomas Becket. Thomas was born in Southwark, near London, around 1110. He was a descendant of the Normans. He was a lawyer, first and foremost, in his early life. And for much of his early life, there really isn't any evidence that he took spiritual responsibility seriously at all. I feel like I'm vaping with this thing. As a young man, he had entered the household of Archbishop Theobald, where he manifested himself to be efficient, reliable, ambitious, and egotistical. His talents, however, were rewarded by his being made the Archdeacon of Canterbury, and it was there where he became quite chummy with Henry II. Henry was immediately drawn to him. He's a lawyer. He's efficient. And, and he appointed him to one of the, in AD 1154, he appointed Thomas to one of the highest positions in England. He was the Chancellor of England. So we have a young man who is both Archdeacon and a Chancellor, and this becomes a pattern and problem for the church throughout this time period and later, especially when we get to Richard and John. He was a good, solid legal officer of the crown. He devoted himself to royal service, and for 8 years, king and chancellor hung out, establishing a warm and binding friendship. Becket wasted no time implementing his clear idea of what a chancellor should be, and took infinite pains to make his court and household the most magnificent in England. He lavishly entertained, he hunted, he hawked, he surrounded himself with the richest and most influential men in the country. Even Henry II could barely rival the magnificence and the opulence of Thomas's domicile. So after years of ruminating, Henry announced that Becket would succeed Theobald as Archbishop of Canterbury. Becket's immediate response was to laugh. Are you kidding me? And he warned Henry, you don't want to do this. He thought it was a joke. And he actually stated that, Henry, if you do this, you're going to regret it. Henry insisted, and despite considerable opposition from some of the Canterbury monks, the election was made. Thomas was ordained and this one is something that sticks in the craw of every priest. Thomas was ordained a priest on 2 June 1162, and Archbishop 3 June 1162. And whether you realize it or not, that is not as bizarre as you would think. It can actually happen today in extreme circumstances. It's rare, but it can happen. So, once Thomas now was the Archbishop, his whole manner of life changed. He threw aside all of the opulence, he threw aside all of the riches, and he adopted a life of asceticism. He essentially became a monastic and lived in almost seclusion at Canterbury. Now, some will look at this and say, well, he was a hypocrite, but you have to understand that Becket was one of those men who visualized the part they were to play, and then they would adapt their lives to the type which they had created in their minds. So, as the chancellor, he was one thing. That was the role he was playing, and he played it to the hilt. But now, as the Archbishop, he goes in the other direction, and he plays that out. So the first thing that Becket does to fulfill his own prophecy is insist that Henry give proper deference to the papacy and declares the church free, and also no longer requires feudal homage that is part and parcel of the relationship between church and king for most of the 12th century. So he's almost going, I told you so. So as chancellor, he saw himself acting out one role. As archbishop, he's acting out another. He saw himself as the leading churchman in England, fighting for God and the freedom of the church, his church, against all tyranny and oppression, which, of course, begs the question that the monarchy was viewed as tyranny and oppression. And he was able to adapt his life accordingly. Henry was, of course, baffled and infuriated. His friend is this young man, this one in whom he placed such confidence and high aspirations, is now, to pardon the expression, pissing in his cereal. The man whom he had as the greatest friend, whom he had hoped to make his staunchest ally overnight, became utterly estranged from him, with every indication of turning into his bitterest enemy. The stage was thus immediately set for a quarrel on a grand scale. Evidenced by Henry's comment, England is not two bushes that can hold two, such as Archbishop and myself. So the conflict is set, and it wasn't long in coming. At first it was concerned with minor questions, but soon the problem of the criminous clerks arose. As I said, this is from multiple historical sources. I'm just quoting the phrases that I just find most amusing, and criminous clerks just tickles me. So Henry was determined that the clergy should be brought within the framework of the law and demanded that clerks, having been convicted in the ecclesiastical courts, should be degraded and sent to the secular courts for punishment. So he's looking to exact his pound of flesh. Becket regarded this as a gross infringement of the liberties of the church, declared degradation of a priest was itself a punishment, and that Henry's plans ran counter to the elements of justice by punishing a man twice for one offense. Keep that in mind, because that's really big in our judicial system. Double jeopardy. He therefore insisted that only for a second offense, a new offense, could courts punish a man who had once been ordained, and at that point we fall right back into the hamster wheel of whether or not this is going to be a benefit of the clergy or going to be tried in the civil courts. And now we start the merry-go-round all over again. So a deadlock was therefore reached. And it was to deal with this and other problems that Henry summoned the First Council of Westminster in 1163 and then the Council of Clarendon in 1164. At Clarendon, a set of constitutions was drawn up, in which an attempt was made to codify the ancient law, especially in the matter of relations between church and state. Notice how we keep coming back to this. The constitutions tried to prohibit appeals to Rome. No talking to Rome without the king's consent. And we know how that went. The constitutions tried to prohibit appeals to, I already said that, and to prevent clergy from leaving the country. You ain't going anywhere. You got a problem? You deal with it here. They also dealt with the question of criminous clerks, declaring that a clerk once tried, convicted, and degraded in a bishop's court should then be punished as a layman and may no longer claim the support of the church. If you're convicted, you lose your status of clergy. Once you lose the status of clergy, you are now just a normal person. Once you are now a normal person, guess where you're going? Right into the civil dock. There was a lengthy debate which Becket regarded as a direct attack upon the rights of the church and opposed it with everything in his being, with little to no support from other bishops. He was alone, browbeaten, worn down by opposition on all fronts. He was persuaded to give his consent, which at last he did. But he immediately repented his actions and waited and looked for an opportunity to show his utter disapproval of what had been done. He felt shame and embarrassment that in a moment of weakness, he didn't live up to his own ideals. Who does that sound like within British history? There's a remarkable parallel right here. I'll give you a hint. 300 years later.
Henry.
No, not Henry, but you're close.
Cranmer.
Cranmer conceded. He recanted everything he believed, and then after reflection came to the same conclusion that Thomas did. And if you remember the story, which we won't get into, but if you'll remember the story, when Mary decided to burn him at the stake, the first element that he put in was his hand that signed the recanting document. He held his hand in that fire. Well, all Thomas needed was an opening, and he didn't have to wait long. A minor difficulty over the Archbishop's estates in Sussex served as an opportunity for him to make a stand against what he regarded as tyranny and oppression. And I'm sure Teresa could comment on this, where lawyers will push a crack just to get the opportunity to stand before the court, and now let's bring out all of the evidence that you guys didn't want exposed. And this was the lawyer in Becket. He was summoned to appear at the Council of Northampton in 1164, and you don't have to memorize these dates. Thank you. And it was there, after some months of indecision, he threw down the gauntlet to challenge the king. There must be no further halting between two opinions, was his thought. Men must decide where they are to serve, church or king. So striding into the hall, bearing his primal cross, bearing his cross in his own hands, he defied the king. He refused to hear the judgment pronounced upon him, threatened with excommunication any who dared to consent, and then he solemnly walked out through the crowd of infuriated courtiers, none of whom dared touch him. Predictably, Henry doesn't like any of what has just taken place. Now, there's another scene in history that is very reminiscent of that scene. Anybody have an idea?
Sir Thomas More?
Thomas More didn't walk out, he was dragged out. Luther at the Diet of Worms. Here I stand, unless I am persuaded by sound reason or good conscience, I cannot, because it is neither safe nor healthy to violate conscience. Here I stand, God help me, I can do no other. And then he is whisked out by his companion. Slightly different, but the same basic idea. Make your statement and beat feet. Well, Becket fled overseas, hoping that Henry would kind of cool off. And for 6 years, he remained abroad, mostly at the Cistercian Abbey of Pontigny, Pontigny, of France, which is approximately 150 miles southeast of Paris, where he immediately adopted the full rigors of the monastic life, and during these years of exile, he brooded over his wrongs and became even more stubborn, if that was possible. He grew more hard, more determined, and more ruthless. He saw himself now as the persecuted champion of the faith, God's suffering servant, the sole survivor of those who had refused to bow the knee to Baal. Got to admire his flair for the dramatic. The quarrel about criminous clerks had now been largely forgotten. Becket's mind had moved away from a local dispute on a matter of justice. What troubled his mind now, was the question of ultimate authority. And he at least was determined to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. It was not, however, until 1170 that some type of peace is brokered, and Becket felt free to return to England. He crossed to Sandwich on December 1st, I guess he had lunch, and made triumphant progress to Canterbury, where he was warmly received by the crowds. Far cry from his trial. But his mind was full of foreboding, and once again, he opposes the king over investiture. Again, investiture raises its ugly head. The return of Becket, however, greatly alarmed his enemies in England, especially the Archbishop of York and the bishops of London and Salisbury, because Becket appealed to Rome and had them excommunicated. So they weren't too happy about his return. So these three prelates immediately went to France to lay their grievances before the king, who, sick and tired of the whole weary business, burst out in frustration and anger and uttered that famous line, "Who will rid me of this troublesome, turbulent priest?" I'm sure
Who said that?
Henry II. Henry was the one that said that.
Okay, okay.
And the former senior warden with the different.
I was just going to say, depending upon the perspective of which the person to whom you're speaking, you may get that from either a priest or a bishop. So, I'm sure the sentiment runs both ways. Well, 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, Morville, William Deracy, Deracy, and Richard Le Breton heard the outburst of anger from the king, and they immediately laid a plot to eliminate the problem. They crossed the channel, they arrived at Canterbury at about midday on the 29th of December. They forced their way into the Archbishop's chamber while he was at dinner, and a politely phrased stormy altercation took place over the excommunication of the 3 bishops. Becket refused to retract, and the 4 knights went away, as this particular author would say, with murder in their hearts. It's now an Agatha Christie novel. An hour or so later, they returned fully armed. The monks attempted to barricade the house and dragged the archbishop into the great church. They also tried to defend him, but Becket refused the house of God to be turned into a fortress. He wouldn't allow it. So now the murderers approached from the cloisters. They pushed through the crowds into the church, and they encountered Becket in the chapel at the north transept, where he had placed himself by a pillar. Cue Richard Burton. By this time, all companions had fled. Becket was alone, with the exception of Edward Grimm, who stood with him to the last, tried to defend Becket, but his arm had already been broken in the previous assault, so he was essentially ineffective. And within a matter of minutes, it was over. Becket lay dead on the floor of the church. His murderers marched unmolested through the terrified crowds who filled the cloisters on that dark winter afternoon. Henry was horrified, at least as the reports go, and was left with a tremendous amount of egg on his face, to put it mildly, and immediately attempted to justify himself by swearing that he had not intended for the Archbishop's death, that he would be faithful to the Pope, that he would allow appeals to Rome, renounce any attempt to introduce customs detrimental to the Church, and, if necessary, go on a crusade. And in spite of Henry's protestations that he never intended it to go that far, none of the knights who were involved in the assassination of Thomas Becket were ever brought to justice. They're allowed to disappear into the Flanders, into the Holy Roman Empire, and there they stayed unmolested for the rest of their days. However, the papacy, never one to miss out on an opportunity, takes advantage of the bad publicity that Henry had attracted to himself by his killing of the Archbishop. And some years later, he visited Canterbury. So in 1174, at the tomb of the Archbishop, at the tomb of Thomas, Henry is publicly forced to accept papal claims and has to undergo a humiliating penance at the hands of the monks of Christ's Church Priory in the Cathedral of Canterbury. Henry was required to march barefoot from the last pilgrimage station on the edge of town to the shrine of Thomas Becket. He was required to get down on his knees before the shrine, and he is beaten with rods by the monks, and of course, at the conclusion, leaves a considerable amount of cash behind. Probably the most painful part of the whole ordeal for Henry II. And this was to help the rebuilding of the Canterbury Cathedral. Becket's death rearranged the relationship between church and state to the point where, in most respects, provided the papacy respected Henry's opinion, was prepared to let the papacy have what it thought was its rights from the English church. So, taxation paid to Rome, papal approval of all senior appointments, the investiture of ring and pastoral staff by the papal legate, and the papal legates were granted quite a bit of freedom of action throughout the realm. And this structures the relationship between the English king and the papacy through the rest of Henry's reign till his death in AD 1198 and the remaining years of the 12th century. For over 300 years, the shrine of Becket at Canterbury stood as a witness to the triumph of church over state. That is until 1538. Anybody have an idea as to what happened in 1538? Who was king in 1538? Henry VIII decided that he was going to destroy the shrine of Thomas and have his bones scattered. Now, despite all of this, Henry managed to carry through the main part of his policy, when you think about it: encourage respect for the law and build a stable government, which allowed England essentially to survive the disastrous reigns of Henry's two sons, Richard and John. Richard the Lionheart is probably the second worst king in English history, at least from the point of view of being a king in England. He was never there. In his 10-year reign, anybody know how long he was in England during his 10-year reign?
Very little.
4 months. He was the physical king for 4 months. He was either in the Holy Land, he was in France, or he was in captivity somewhere for 9.5 of the 10 years that he reigned. For him, it was, as we've talked about, it was a convenient cash cow to finance the Crusades. Nevertheless, his crusading made him extremely popular with the papal court. He left the administration of England very largely in the hands of bishops and other senior noblemen who literally chopped up the government. There were, let me give you one example. Bishop Hubert Walter was the Archbishop of Canterbury for 1193 to 1205. Now, he's the Archbishop. He held, in addition to being Archbishop, in addition to his primacy, he held the office of Legate, Chief Justice, Chancellor, and Vice-Regent of the Kingdom. So, there was a disaster. And if this wasn't bad enough, Geoffrey Plantagenet, the illegitimate son of Henry II, he was born prior to Henry becoming the king, at this time becomes a priest at 14, wise counsel, and the Bishop of London 7 years later, a 21-year-old bishop. There was, however, at this time, one one, can you imagine, one really sound bishop, and that was Hugh of Lincoln. Well, Richard's brother, Prince John, essentially wound up taking an increasing role in the administration of England, which was, in and of itself, a disaster. After Richard's accidental death in the siege in Aquitaine in 1199, John succeeds him. Did you know what John's nickname was? John's nickname was John Lackland, because when he was born, nobody expected him to get anything as far as lands. And if that weren't bad enough, John's reign, as brief as it was, ended the Angevin Empire. At the time that John took over, the King of England controlled all of England, most of Ireland, all of Wales, and a significant portion of Western France. When John left, it was gone. All of it. Philip II of France essentially took it all away from John. And it was gone by 1208. Now he also, by his capricious and unstable government, alienated most of the barons. He didn't take counsel. He was, by all accounts, and I'm going to give you the litany of description of who John was. He was tough, he was stout, energetic. He was a tough, stout, energetic little man of amazing versatility. Other accounts of John are that he was cruel and ruthless, violent and passionate, greedy and self-indulgent, genial and repellent, arbitrary and judicious, clever and capable, original and inquisitive. Pick your poison. John refused to surround himself with wise counselors, and he kept his own counsel. Bad move. Upon the death of Archbishop Walter, an immediate conflict ensued, of course. The younger monks, meeting hours after the death of the Archbishop, promptly nominated their sub-prior, Reginald. This ticked everyone off, and the king immediately countered with the Bishop of Norwich, John de Grey, who was one of his good friends. Well, there was an appeal made to Rome. They split the Gordian knot and chose Stephen Langton. Stephen Langton becomes one of the most pathetic figures in British ecclesiastical history. And hopefully we can get that in a minute. John found himself lumbered with Langton as the Archbishop, who, after a botched election by the monks of Christ's Church, failed attempting at providing a royal candidate which had been imposed on the Pope, and which had been imposed by the Pope on an unwilling John. Langton spends the first 6 years of his term as the Archbishop in France and Italy, waiting for the political situation to change sufficiently for him to actually go to Canterbury and take office. Papacy does its best to help Stephen by placing England under interdict on the 23rd of March, 1208. You know what interdict is?
Like a territorial excommunication.
No ecclesiastical functions can occur with the exception of burial and what was the other one? Baptisms. Baptisms and burials were the only ecclesiastical functions that could take place under interdict.
So no mass.
Nope. That's the intention. Put pressure on the people to put pressure on the clergy. There's no mass. The office is said in private by the clergy, and there are no public services. John could care less, and he actually uses this as a means to raise money for his own use. First, He seizes all ecclesiastical property. He confiscates the entire profits of all of those that went overseas. And this goes on for 4 years. It's only when John himself is excommunicated by Innocent III, and then when that proved ineffective, Innocent threatens John with being deposed in 1212. So you combine this with John's knowledge of Philip II of France planning an invasion of England, and in 1213 John relinquishes his crown and the kingdom to the Pope. Now do you see the massive shift that just occurred? And this is going to inform that question we always ask: what is Anglicanism? Because now it becomes a matter of what time period we're talking. So, when John does this, the invasion is called off. Langdon returns to Canterbury. John was absolved, though the interdict remained in effect for another year. And the acknowledgement of papal authority completely changes the landscape of English life. From the moment of Langton's return, attempts were made to circumscribe the power of the throne in order to prevent such a disastrous, disgraceful episode from ever happening again. So Langton comes back and he tries to stop what just happened. Another John. Well, his efforts resulted in a meeting on the 15th of June, 1215, in order for a document to be signed, the Magna Carta. John humiliatingly has to sign away his kingdom to the Pope, only receiving them back as a vassal to the Pope, promising to pay the Pope in an indemnity of 1,000 marks a year, a fortune. And the first great clause of the document is the English Church shall be free, meaning that it shall have freedom to elect its officers according to canon law. And this might have been a slam against royal prestige, but did little to promote the independence of the English Church, since in every disputed election, the papacy now had power to intervene and to veto. And this really rubs the aristocracy of England the wrong way. They don't want to be papal vassals. They want a king who will obey the law. And this essentially is the substance behind the Magna Carta. When the Magna Carta was first signed and copied, a copy was sent to each of the English cathedrals throughout the land. And, if you're at all interested, one of the better copies of the Magna Carta is available this day for viewing in the Lincoln Cathedral. You can actually go when it's actually in country. The Magna Carta tours. It has its own entourage. So, Langdon, who was a godly man and taught theology at the Curia, finds himself rather in the middle between Pope and King. On the one hand, he'd been a staunch supporter of papal claims over the English Church. But when he attempts to assist the barons by helping John get his head out of that rather tight physical location that is very dark and smelly, and sign the Magna Carta, he is promptly suspended from office by the Pope for supporting the king. And once again, Langdon winds up in exile. John dies in 1216 whilst crossing a wash, which he seems to have picked up some type of infection, and he died at Newark, not New Jersey. And Stephen returns at that time only to find that the country was now firmly in the hands of papal legates, and he, as the Archbishop of Canterbury, had very little opportunity to either influence the church or the crown. And it wasn't until AD 1221 that he could once again act as the Archbishop, after holding the office for 14 years. And that is where we are in the history of England with the relationships between these men and how they influenced what will take place going forward. Now it's no longer the English church and the Roman church. Now it's no longer the English church against or in concert with the royal monarchy. Now it's the Roman church, firmly entrenched with authority in England. Now, it doesn't mean that England gave up her genetic independence. The English are always, as we've talked about, oh yes, very good idea, thank you, very appreciate your time. Have a nice day. Get them out of here. That's pretty much the English. They'll say whatever they need to say to maintain peace and then get out. So we still have Ireland, we still have the Celts, we still have Wales, we still have the North and the West. But the vast majority of England now is under papal control. And the reason it becomes critical when we ask what is Anglicanism is because at this point in 1215, 1216, a huge council will be called on the continent at Lateran, and that's going to decide Roman theology, which then will decide English theology because of the connection now that is being imposed on England because of papal oversight and Roman oversight into the English church. And this is going to define the nature of the church, both in England and in the Holy Roman Empire for the next, well, if you remain a Roman Catholic, forever. If you're a Brit, for the next 300 years, till the English Reformation. Okay. Few minutes. Questions? Let me ask you a question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, we were seeing under John, basically, the Rome going beyond just control of the English church, but really exercising a lot of control over civil government.
Mm-hmm. That's part of it. That was part of it.
What did they use as their doctrinal or legal, argument for asserting?
That's the investiture question.
Oh, okay.
That's where the investiture question becomes critical, because let's just take the question on its face. Who has the right to identify ecclesiastical leadership? Right? Does the church get the right to pick its own leaders, or is it the crown that picks the leaders? If it's the church that picks the leaders, then the second question is, to whom is your fealty? Is your fealty to the crown or to the church? And the more the theological arguments begin to pile up, the more pressure is placed on the average parishioner, because they don't want to be excommunicated. They don't want to lose their salvation. They don't want to be barred from heaven. So what winds up happening? You push your barons, you push your lords to the degree that you're able to submit. And slowly but surely, the Holy Roman Empire from the continent now creeps over into the British Isles, and through this seismic shift that occurs with Henry, Thomas, John, Richard, and John, sounds like a singing group, royal independence now becomes papal subservience. And this demonstrated the power of the papacy at the time to influence politics. An interdict, an excommunication, which John basically went, but when the threat of being deposed was uttered, that's when he buckled. Because, and the question is, well, how would the Pope depose a king? Because he had the barons, and he had that type of power on his side. For the most part. Not all barons, obviously, because there were many barons that did not want to be papal vassals, but there were very prominent people that were in favor of that papal oversight, and
They just didn't want to be excommunicated.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And this is what leads all the way up to the Reformation, and this is why it's critical to understand exactly what Henry was doing. Henry wasn't leaving. Henry was not leaving the Roman Church. That was not what Henry was doing. What Henry was doing was returning to the pre-1300s and the investiture issue. I'm the king of my own country. I am, not you. I'm going to do what I want to do. So when we start talking about Anglicanism now in the 16th century with Henry, now the question is, oh, well, you guys are just Roman light. Well, yeah, not really. Not really. Because if you go back to what it was prior, you can see there's independence. And that's what Henry wanted, amongst other things. You know, we know about the divorce and all of that nonsense. And Henry had a case as far as the legal issue of it, because the papacy had granted divorces to other monarchs. So Henry wasn't wrong. He just happened to be married to the wrong person. So, anyway.
But that was sort of the way it was resolved in the East, at least initially, moving the other direction, right? Where, yeah,
went to the church.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. One more question, and then I can let you go for morning prayer.
Well, so
Yes.
was Rome really just biding its time? Really? I mean, because even when William comes over, they see, oh, this is going to get better because we've got a Norman, and things will start to go more like the continent instead of the unruly Anglo-Saxons. And like, do you think they were premeditating, even though it took some time?
I'm going to surprise you, and at this point, I'm going to give Rome the benefit of the doubt. And what I'm going to say is, for the most part, what Rome was attempting to do was to function in good faith, and through theological and ecclesiastical interaction, try and get England into the fold. Okay? Now, I'm giving them a positive read at that point. There are people that will give them a much more negative read. And I'm sure that there are popes that arose at this time that were, nasty and vicious, and they were just going to come down with a heavy hand. But I think on the grand scale, being gracious, that they were looking to create a unified church, and they wanted England to be a part of that unified church. The problem was, when you have that desire, and then you have the resistance with which England was mounting and maintaining, the means by which you attempt to draw that unity into being changes. So rather than having this gracious, hey, this is what the doctrine is, this is what we want, we're looking for all of the brotherhood, rather than it being that, it's like, okay, you want to be petulant? We know how to deal with petulant little children. We're going to spank your bottom, and then we're going to make you obey. So it winds up becoming that. I don't believe that was, and again, I'm being very generous and very gracious, I don't believe that was the initial intent. If you go all the way back to St. Augustine in the 7th century, when Gregory sends him over there, and what does St. Augustine say? Hey, they got this whole thing going on over here. They're doing this, they're doing that, they're doing the other thing. And Gregory's response was, well, as long as they're not violating the faith, leave them alone. That's why I give them a bit more latitude than maybe others.
But how many popes followed that?
Oh yeah, that's as I said. I mean, I'm sure you're going to find popes that were just ornery, but I think at least initially it was collegial, it was filial, and they were looking for unity.
Where do you think Innocent III falls on that?
He comes down with the hammer. I mean, he was the one that told John, okay, first interdict, second excommunication, third, I'm going to cut your knees out from underneath you. So he doesn't play. He doesn't play patty cake.
But John did that to himself.
Pardon me?
I mean, John did it to himself.
Yeah, but the Pope didn't need to do it that way. He didn't need to do an interdict. Because the interdict didn't hurt John. The interdict hurted the people. They couldn't receive communion. So he was applying oblique, tangential pressure on the monarchy. It wasn't, I mean, John could care less. I don't care. I'll just pillage churches. I don't know what I care. Until he lost his moneymaker. When that was threatened, then it was like, okay, well, bets are off.